The CSS Styles panel acts as the central hub for all things CSS in Dreamweaver, providing you with both a global view of all document styles, as well as allowing you to focus on individual rules and style applications. So for this exercise, I have our resources.html file open in the 0604 folder. Now, you're going to find the CSS Styles panel in the CSS panel grouping. And that's usually located at the top of the panel dock, although you can reposition it in custom workspaces if you'd like. Now, I'm going to give myself a little bit more room here by double-clicking on the Files panel tab. That'll collapse that, and that'll give us a full dock to work here with the CSS Styles panel, because depending upon the view you're looking at it with, it can take up a lot of room. Now, at the very top of the panel, you'll find buttons for two views, All and Current. The All view gives you an overview of all of the CSS styles applied to the current document, while the Current view gives you a detailed view of the rules applied to a selected element. Before we start creating our styles in earnest, let's take a moment to get a little bit more comfortable with finding our way around and using the CSS Styles panel. Now, if I click on All and I scroll all the way up to the top of my rules listing, I can see that I have an external style sheet linked to this file. How do I know it's an external style sheet? Because it says main.css. I can see the extension. I can collapse all these rules, and if you had multiple style sheets or embedded styles, you would see all of those guys listed as well. But for this particular file, we just have the one external style sheet linked. Now, we do have some parentheses right out beside it that says screen, projection. Those are referring to the media type for the style sheet. And if I switch over to the code view of the page, you can see right here in this link file, we have an attribute that says media equals screen, projection. That means that these styles are being applied to any devices that request the screen or projection media type. So these styles wouldn't apply to screen readers or other user agents like that. I'm going to switch back to design view, and let's take a look at specific rules. I'm going to click right here in this single rule, Got Questions. Now, I can see by looking at the structure of my page and my tag selector that this is inside of a heading 1, which is inside of a div with the ID of main article, which is inside of a div with an ID of main content. So I can look for some specific rules that are controlling that element. However, it's a lot easier to find if I click inside that and switch over to current mode. Current mode tells me exactly the rule that I'm targeting. And I'm just going to expand this out a little bit so you guys can see this a little bit better, because sometimes that's a little hard to see. And I may need to rearrange these panels a little bit. So notice that you can take the CSS Styles panel and you can begin to move these dividers to give yourself a little bit more room. Let's examine the current rule in a little bit more detail. The top pane gives us a summary for the current selection. And here we see all of the properties that are styling our currently selected content. Now, not all of these properties necessarily come from the same rule. That's one of the things about CSS. You'll notice that if you hover over one of those properties, it'll tell you exactly which rule they're coming from. Notice that they're not all coming from the same rule. Now, if we look down below that, we can see all of the rules that are affecting this element. And I can scroll back and forth to see which rules are affecting it the most. The ones at the bottom are the most specific styles, and any content set here would overwrite content set in the styles above it. Finally, down below that, if I select any of these individual rules, I get the properties for those specific rules. And if I want, I could even add additional properties to this. So let's say that I wanted a little bit of extra spacing down below this headline. I could select the rule that I want to affect it, in this case, pound main content, main article H1, and I could just click right here to add a property. Now you can grab that pull-down list if you're not as familiar with property names, or if you know what you're wanting to do, you could just type it in. In this case, I'm going to choose margin-bottom. Just going to add a little bit of space underneath this, so I'm going to type in 0.4 ems, and that's EM, so I can just type in 0.4 EM and hit return, and that's going to increase the spacing. You can see the text here went down by just a little bit. So anytime you want, you can use the CSS Styles panel to add to an existing rule without having to go into any code or open up any additional dialog boxes. Now, I'm going to switch back to All for just a moment and talk about what types of things we can display in the All view. First off, we get all of our rules that are in our external style sheet. So a lot of times here, you have to scroll down until you find the rule that you're looking for. So if I scroll down, I can find right here, pound main content, pound main article H1. That's the rule that we just changed. If I click on that, I can see that now I have the same summary of the properties in that rule, and I have the ability to add properties here as well. Well, you can change how this panel displays these rules. If you notice in the CSS Styles panel, there are 3 icons in the lower left-hand corner of the All view. The first icon gives us what is known as a category view. It's going to be a listing of all the categories such as fonts, backgrounds, block level changes, borders, box model. So if you're familiar with these categories, you can quickly access them and change properties directly through this category listing. We also have a listing that shows a list view of every single CSS property that you can change, and there are a lot of them. So if you like that view, you get a nice alphabetical list of those. Any properties that are being used and set on the rule will appear at the very top of the listing, and they're highlighted and colored in blue. Finally, we have my favorite view. The favorite view shows only the properties that you have set, and it reduces the amount of clutter that you have to look at. That's my preferred view, and that's typically what I'll do. Now, the CSS Styles panel can be used for a lot more too. Let's say we want to create a different rule. In this case, maybe we want to create a rule that's going to control this heading 2. It's going to be very similar to what we had before, so I'm just going to scroll down and click inside that heading 2. I'm going to go down to my CSS Styles panel, and in the lower right-hand corner, there's another set of icons. The one that has the page with the plus symbol on it, if you hover over that, it'll tell you that's a new CSS rule. I'm going to click on that. Now, we're going to cover this dialog box in a little bit more detail later on. Suffice to say that this dialog box is going to assist you in creating your rules. In this case, notice that it automatically came up with what we call a compound selector because it knows that there are a lot of factors identifying that element on the page. So we're seeing here wrapper, main content, main article, H2. Well, I'm going to get a little less specific with it because if you remember our previous rule that had the H1 had the main content and the main article, but it didn't have wrapper, so that's not really necessary. So I'm going to choose less specific, and now it resolves itself to say pound main content, pound main article, H2. Perfect. I can also tell Dreamweaver where to place these styles. In this case, I'm going to place it in main.css, which is that external style sheet. Your other choice is to place it in this document only, which would embed it in the head of the file, or you can create a brand new style sheet to place that in as well. I'm going to leave that as main.css and click OK. Now, this is a great dialog box. What we get now is the CSS rule definition dialog box. This is a dialog box that's separated by categories: typography, background, block properties, box model properties that you can go through and set each one of those properties for this specific rule. So again, if you're not that familiar with CSS, this is a great dialog box to access because it gives you an ability to go ahead and choose all these items for your particular element. In this case, font size, I'm going to click in font size and say 1.6 EM. You can just type in EM, or you can grab M's from the pull-down menu right there. So 1.6 EM. For color, I'm going to type in pound 51341A. If you hit tab, you can see that that's going to be that brown color that we're using throughout our site. Now, CSS can either use RGB values or hexadecimal notation for color values. Most people use hexadecimal values, although with the advent of CSS3 and HTML5, RGB values are starting to be used in an increasing amount. Font weight, I'm going to grab that pull-down menu and choose normal. Most headings are bold by default, but I want this heading to not be bold, so I'm going to change font weight to normal. I'm also going to go down and set a couple of other properties in my box category. The box category is where you choose things like padding and margin, so it's primarily used for spacing. For margin, I'm going to deselect same for all, and for top margin, I'm going to type in 1.2 EM. For bottom margin, I'm just going to type in 1 EM. Now, if you're curious about what an M is, we'll have a movie a little bit later on that describes unit of measurements, but an M is a unit of measurement typically used in relation to type. Finally, we're going to do one more thing that might be a little confusing for those of you who are new to CSS. We're going to grab this clear property and we're going to choose both. What that will do is it tells Dreamweaver, don't allow objects to float to my left or float to my right. It's basically going to make sure that this heading is on its own line and not affected by any floats that we may have placed into our file. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and I can see right there my heading changes. Now, you'll notice that it placed that rule right underneath the H1 tag. How did it know to do that? Well, it wasn't guessing. It was the fact that I actually had the H1 rule selected in my styles before I created it. So if you want to control the placement of where your rules go, make sure you highlight the rule just above where you want it to be. Although you can certainly select rules and drag them up and down the order to organize them if you would like. Now, I know it seems like we've covered a lot of ground, but to be honest, we've just scratched the surface of what we can do with the CSS Styles panel. Don't worry, you'll be using the CSS Styles panel throughout the rest of this title. That's going to give you plenty of time to familiarize yourself with those capabilities, as well as exploring some of its additional functionality a little bit later on.